is the rhythm of semiotic landscape, pop, soundscapes, and language ideologies among Nepalese followers of a Japanese new religion. Tenrikyō, Teachings of the Heavenly Wisdom, is a Japanese new religion that is one of those religions that have emerged in Japan since the 19th century onward. These new religious traditions often define themselves in opposition to more established Shinto or Buddhist religious groups, although they share the certain teachings. This paper, which stems from fieldwork conducted around 2011-2012 with a follow-up in 2024, will focus on a group of Nepalese followers of Tenrikyō practicing in Kathmandu, who engage in the performance of a daily ritual involving chanting, dancing, and playing traditional Japanese instruments. And through this ritual, which also conveys a specific language ideology, Nepalese followers create a semiotic landscape characterized by a new space and a new temporality, where their subjectivity and their identity as Tenrikyō believers emerge. Tenrikyō followers trace the origin of their religion to the 26th of October 1838, when the foundress Nakayama Miki, also called Oyasama, the parent, received the revelation by Tenri no Mikoto, Lord of the Heavenly Wisdom, also called Oyagami-sama, God the Parent. Included in the revelation was the truth of creation, which states, the purpose for which God created humankind and the world was to see the joyous life and to share that joy. Such a joyous life, which would be Yoki Gurashi in Japanese and Andi Jiba in Nepali, is conceptualized in the doctrines as an ideal society where people help each other and live happily, following the teachings of God the Parent. And this is an image from one of the booklets. That's how, let's say, the booklet sort of portrays the joyous life. As you can see, everything is joyous, is named joyous. So each shop, hotel, restaurant, theater, the gekijo is called Yoki, joyous, and even the hot air balloon, I don't know if you can read it, but it's called the joyous life. People help each other, and it's a very kind of altruistic and kind, ideal society. There are three are the main practices observed by Tenrikyō followers. One, the osazuke, a healing ritual. The second one is hinokishin, voluntary or altruistic work. And the third one is the otsutome, the service. The otsutome is a ritual of salvation performed monthly and yearly around the karodai, a divine pillar located in Tenri City, Japan, at the center of the main shrine. You can see the shrine and the karodai depicted in the image on the right. This pillar is said to mark the exact spot where humankind was created, and the area surrounding it, where Tenrikyō headquarters is located, is also called the Jiba, which literally means the place or land or spot. Together with the osazuke, the otsutome constitutes the so-called path of single-hearted salvation, and it is understood to have salvific power. I will focus on this ritual, but in the form that it takes when performed daily at sunrise to offer gratitude and prayers to God. The ritual consists of two parts. The first one, which is called the suaritome, which means seated service, during which the Tenrikyō followers, sitting in Japanese style and oriented towards Jiba, so the place where humankind was created, they perform a series of hand gestures, singing in Old Japanese. And the second one, called the Theodori, which is the dance with hand movements. Theodori consists of 12 numbered songs in Old Japanese, which convey Tenrikyō truths. Followers play 2 of them every day, then interpolating a prologue called Yorozuyo on the 7th day. Together, all the songs sung for the Suaritome, so for the seated service, and the Theodori, the dance, they form part of the Mikagura Uta, the songs for the service, one of the 3 scriptures of Tenrikyō. The Mikagura Uta was composed by the foundress as a form of prayer to God, and it is considered the means of single-hearted salvation. So it's supposed to have salvific power when you perform it. Every morning at around 7 a.m., Nepalese followers of Tenrikyō belonging to Mitsumoya Church gather in a small room on the top floor of a building located in Chhatrapati, a central area in Kathmandu, to perform the ritual. Most of them don't speak Japanese, and yet they learn the songs by heart and memorize the related steps and gestures. In this paper, I will focus on the performance of Yorozuyo, so the prologue, and on the second song of Theodori, to show how the enactment of this Otsutome morning ritual shapes the subjectivities of followers, connecting them to a different place and the hoped for future, while simultaneously reaffirming an ideology of language according to which the salvific value of these songs rests upon the fact that they are sung in Japanese, as taught by the followers. Section 1. Language ideologies and space in Mitsumoya. Nepalese members of Mitsumoya Church belong to a specific ethnic group called the Newars, the indigenous inhabitants of the Kathmandu Valley. They are middle class and mostly middle-aged Newars, sharing family relations or friendship ties and running various businesses in the city. They belong to Hindu or Buddhist castes like Shrestha, Shakya, Tuladhar, Kansakar, and Maharjan. And when they arrive at the Mitsumoya Center, they usually greet each other in Nepali or more often in Newar language. And they do some small talk before putting on the Tenrikyō attire that you can see in the pictures, a black jacket called happy, and entering the prayer room. Once there, their attitude and their way of moving changes completely as they bow towards the altar and take their places to start the ritual. Such change of attitude could be conceptualized as an effective response to the place of worship and its connection with the main shrine in Jiba, Japan, also generated by the chanting. In a chapter entitled Reverencing the Landscape in Language, Space, and Cultural Play, Theorizing Affect in the Semiotic Landscape, we and Go look at, quote, the ways in which sites such as places of worship construct affective responses of reverence, respect, and awe, end quote. In this chapter, they analyze genocide memorials, places of worship, and cemeteries, and try to look at the semiotic strategies of physical demarcation, for example, barriers, linguistic marks, etc., and behavioral prescriptions, like, for example, about keeping quiet, not using phones, avoiding touching, etc., which make visitors cultivate a shared and collective attitude of deference and respect. When entering the ritual room in Chhatrapati, the altar where Oya-sama is enshrined, so the foundress is enshrined, is clearly separated from the rest of the room, as it is located in a slightly elevated deck. And although there are no signs stating this, practitioners know that only those wearing white socks, which are part of the Tenrikyō attire, can step on it. It is usually more experienced members who sit in line on the altar deck facing the shrine, playing the instruments and leading the performance of the Suaritome. This is not how the performance is done. This is a rehearsal kind of a moment. So they're not sitting in line facing the altar because they're practicing moving towards the altar, which is also happens with prescribed movements. But you get a sense of how the altar looks like. When stepping on the altar deck, they do it simultaneously, using the same leg and keeping their hands on their hips, coordinating their steps according to prescribed and rehearsed movements. When performing the Theodori, they step down from the altar and stand in rows with other followers, always facing the altar and thus orienting themselves towards Jiba in Tenri city. Other members sit in separate lines on the right and left side of the room, playing traditional Japanese instruments called narimono, including wooden clappers, which mark the fundamental rhythm of each song. Although prescriptions concerning people's behavior are not visually present, as there are no visible signs, followers know that this area requires a more cautious behavior, and they tend to control their bodily movements, especially before and during the performance of the morning service. This ritual, which lasts half an hour, is concluded by the final greeting to God, the foundress, and the ancestors. These last two entities, although not enshrined in the altar, are present in the main shrine in Jiba, which is located in the same directions in which the followers bow, so that those empty spaces in the altar become a signpost of the spaces in Jiba, where the spirits of the founders and the ancestors are said to be kept. So to the right side and left side of the shrine, there should be two more shrines, but they're not there. But they are in that direction in Jiba, in Japan. In other words, those empty spaces indexically connect the space of the altar in Kathmandu with the space of the altars in Japan, expanding and collapsing the two places. The here of the space of the performance in Nepal, and the there of the place where humankind was created in Jiba, Japan. After the ritual, the atmosphere and the perception of space become more relaxed. And linguistically, people switch from the ritualized form of all the Japanese used in the chants to neighbor language or Nepali, as they start a rehearsing session. So this will be a rehearsing session. They would speak it often in Neighbor, sometimes Nepali. Neighbor language is used to clarify instructions or to further explain Tenrikyō concepts and expressed in the songs. The space of the ritual performance, which is the area facing the altar, is now experienced as a space of practice where followers can repeat the same movements over and over in an attempt to embody those gestures so that they can be performed more neatly and in unison during the ritual, the actual ritual. This practice session is then followed by a convivial moment when people move to a different room to share breakfast. So on the left, you have, on the right side, you have a practice session. On the left side, the kind of convivial moment. When people, here, the languages used are mostly Nepali or Newar, as people talk about the news about contemporary issues in Nepalese society, or other events like upcoming festivals, weddings. And it is here that they also share their memories of past visits to Jiba. And it's here that they make comparisons between Nepalese and Japanese societies. The way in which different languages are used in different spaces or contexts, like the ritual context versus the rehearsing or convivial context, clearly reflects different language ideologies, which are indeed, quote, metadiscursive in nature, end quote, as stated by Jaworski and Turlov. In that, quote, they overlay all language use with value, be it social, cultural, political, moral, economic, or otherwise, end quote. So that, quote, the emplacement or intertextualization of linguistic science is indeed a metadiscursive and of necessity an ideological act, end quote. So in the case of Tenrikyō followers in Nepal, Old Japanese is conceived as the only language suitable to express God the Parent's revelation in the ritual. Nepali is then used to give instructions and communicate in a more kind of neutral way, as it represents the official language of Nepal and the language of the public education system, and also the language that is usually used in working environments. While Newar language is often used to further clarify doctrinal meanings which have already been expressed in Nepali, and it denotes people's belonging to a specific ethnic group, and it also conveys a certain sense of complicity among speakers. So when they joke about not getting the movements right, that happens in Newar language. We could thus say that the use of different languages, according to certain language ideologies, shapes and defines the intersubjective experience of communication in this. Section 2. Semiotic landscape and the construction of a new space through language, hand gestures, materiality, sound, and rhythm. Jaworski and Turlov define semiotic landscape as, quote, any public space with visible inscription made through deliberate human intervention and meaning-making, end quote. And they state that their interest lies on the way in which, quote, written discourse interacts with other discursive modalities, end quote. And these other discursive modalities include visual, verbal, non-verbal, and architectural ones. From their perspective, all landscape is ultimately semiotic, as, quote, meaning is constructed through social cultural interpretation, end quote. And if social moral order is reflected in spatial order, The opposite is also true in that, according to them, quote, the social is spatially constructed and people make sense of their social identity in terms of their environment, end quote. So further developing this idea of semiotic landscape, I would like to focus on how semiotic landscapes, understood at this time as any spatial configuration of meaning, following in this case Marone's idea of a spatial text, can emerge through practices which simultaneously combine linguistic, musical, material, visual, gestural, as well as rhythmic, temporal, and affective elements. I will thus expand the concept of semiotic landscape in two directions. On the one hand, and in this section of the paper, by looking at how a new space is produced through such multimodal ritual performance. And then, on the other hand, in the next section of the paper, by looking at how a new temporality and a related affective regime, and I'm following here we, are generated by this ritual practice. So, following Sasha Newell's remarks on processes of semiosis as, quote, inherently affective and material, end quote, and thus efficacious in rituals, I intend to look at the materiality of the ritual practice, including the soundscape, the rhythm, and the space of the performance. And I will show how generating, or I hope to show how generating an affective stance in the practitioners, it contributes to the efficacy of the ritual, retransforming the performance into Tenrikyō followers every day. I will thus first explore the spatial element of this semiotic landscape, so expanding in terms of space, by looking at three types of space. First, space in the text, that is the way in which the space of Jiba is indexically referred to in the linguistic as well as gestural and acoustic discursive productions, which are part of the ritual, so the songs that talk about Jiba. Then space as text, in that the process of meaning production that emerges from the way in which Nepalese Tenrikyō followers resemiotize the space where they gather for the morning prayer through the practice of this Otstome ritual. And third, the space of the text, that is the way in which these discursive productions themselves occupy a space which is both acoustic, visual, physical, and material. So the first one, space in the text. I will start my analysis by looking at the space in the linguistic text, that is the space which is described in the Yorozyo song, the prologue. The very first line of this song says, "Looking all over the world and through all ages, I find no one that has understood my heart. Yorozyo no sekai, ichiretsu mi haraseru, mune no wakarita mono wa nai." The subject speaking is God the Parent, who sets his point of view as overlooking an extremely broad space-time dimension, where he cannot find anybody who has understood his teachings. And I think it's better if I say this first and then. Oh, let me play it actually. This is the very first, the start, the beginning. So the fact that nobody has really that God cannot find anybody who has understood his teaching, the song continues by saying that is not surprising, as he hasn't fully revealed himself yet. then a different deitic expression, meaning this time, so that is not surprising, but this time, konotabi introduces a different point of view and a different time, the present, when God the Parent states that he will reveal himself to humanity. The following line, introduced by the deitic displays, so konotabi this time and konotokoro displays, then sets a different space, directly connected to Japan and Jiba. The song says, even though you're calling this place Jiba, the home of God, in Yamato, you don't know its origin. Kono tokoro Yamato no Jiba no kamigata to iute iru mo moto shiranu. Through this indexical spatial movement, Jiba, the place in Japan where humankind was originally created by God the Parent, is invoked and brought to the present, here and now, of the space of the performance in Nepal. Although the deitic terms used are part of the discourse of God the Parent and thus anchor his speech to a space and time that is close to him, the fact that Tenrikyō followers perform this ritual every day and that they consider it a means of salvation through which they actually can get closer to the realization of the joyous life in this world, makes these deitics, the deitic anchoring, relevant also for the reality of the performers. Finally, there is another movement marked in the song, in that the final verse says, as I hasten to save all of you equally, I will set out to cheer up all the heart's mind in the world. Ichiretsu hayaku tasuke o isobu kara, sekai no kokoro mo isamekake. This time, the song thus refers to the space of the heart's mind. We move to different space, the heart's mind of each follower, all over the world, who will be cheered up after having received the salvific revelation of God. So similar deitic expressions occur in many other verses of the 12 songs, and each time their deitic power is further stressed by a recurrent pattern of gestures. For example, in the case mentioned above, when saying this time, the hands are firmly pressed down, stopping at the waist level. When mentioning the place Yama, so they do this gesture this time, and then when mentioning the place Yamato, a semicircle is drawn by the index fingers at the level of the head. You've seen that in the video. And when mentioned Jiba, a small semicircle is indicated by the same fingers, but this time at the level of the abdomen. So this gesture that you saw. These gestures are also recur in other songs when the same words are chanted, so they go together. Also, the first syllable of the words this time and this place, konotabi, konotokoro, are further stressed, so in konotabi, are further stressed by the beat of the large drum. The first one was kono. You heard the same drum that you hear here at the end of the verse. When performing the ritual, Nepalese followers say that they have to play or sing attuning to one another, both in the musical sense and in the sense of having a harmonious relation with others. And this disposition, called in Nepali Mamilaera, is also what contributes to the construction of the joyous life. The space and time in the text of these ritual songs, that is, the place Jiba and the present time of God's revelation, this time, is thus made relevant for the performers and it prompts their daily renewal of an attitude of faith and altruism, while also resemioticizing the space of the performance that becomes basically a replica of Jiba. It equals Jiba in Japan. So the next section, space as text. At the same time, the physical space where the followers gather can be analyzed in textual terms. as a porously bounded entity characterized by a partition in three different sections, where three events happen in temporal sequence: getting dressed, performing or rehearsing a ritual, and preparing and sharing breakfast. The place of the performance itself, so these are three areas in the same floor, three different rooms, three different areas. The place of the performance itself, so where the altar is located, can further be analyzed in terms of the partition concerning the area where musicians sit, the altar deck where experienced members lead the ritual, and the frontal section of the room where all other members sit or dance. The spatial text has its internal articulation, but also a hierarchical relation with other rooms or spaces in the same floor. And it is also intertextually connected to the sacred place of Jiba, towards which it is reoriented throughout the performance. Through the songs and the rhythm of movements performed, turning one's gaze in the direction of Jiba, the small room in Nepal where the group gathers is inserted in the same spatial-temporal frame of Jiba in Japan, so that performing the morning ritual in Mitsumoya in Nepal not only mirrors, but rather completely equals to worshipping in Jiba. So the third section, the space of the text. Finally, concerning the space of the text, we could say that the semiotic aggregate of the performance unravels itself throughout words, sounds, music, gestures, movements, and other visual and material elements, which, as described above, occupy their own space in the room and its sound and visual scape. Also, the room itself, the room where the ritual is performed, and the soundscape of the songs, the rhythm and the movement that spatially materially unwinds during the morning service, all these occupy a certain space within the broader urban landscape and soundscape of the city. So I'm going to quote some acoustic material from Kunreter's work, and she has a recording of the soundscape of the city from morning till evening. Just need to show you what's the soundscape outside of that room. So at 7 a.m., when the city comes to life and people commute to work or walk to the local temples and you heard the bells to worship Hindu or Buddhist deities, ringing bells and chanting devotional songs, Tenrikyō followers immerse themselves in a different rhythm made of ancient Japanese words, chanted in unison, following the sound of Japanese instruments like shamisen, koto, and Japanese drums. So that combining gestures and movements, exotic sounds, and linguistic elements, Tenrikyō followers attune themselves to ancient rhythms and cultivate a harmonious attitude of manmidaera, this kind of harmony, creating a new space that is the space of Jiba, where salvation is possible. Section 3. semiotic landscape and the construction of a new temporality and affect, the joyous life as a hoped-for future. In this section of the paper, I will try to show how bringing the sacred land of Jiba in the here and now of the prayer center in Kathmandu, and also constructing it together with the joyous life as two objects of value, that is, two targets that their actions and their inspirations, Nepalese followers of Tenrikyō reshape their subjectivity, emerging as subjects that cultivate a certain relation or attitude towards those objects of value, so towards Jiba and towards the joyous life. In other words, performing the ritual and practicing in its complex and participating in its complex semiotic landscape, Nepalese Tenrikyō believers remind themselves of the existence of Jiba and the joyous life as variable objects towards which they embody a stance of hope and determination. So the affective stance of hope and determination. An affective pull that pushes them to daily perform the ritual and daily engage in the construction of the joyous life. And it is only by iteratively renewing this process on a daily basis that they can emerge as Tenrikyō subjects. So in the Yorozuyo song, the prologue, the first song that you heard, that we looked at earlier, God sets an inchoative moment, because God says this time, in which he will reveal the truth. And he sets a space, this place, so Jiba, as the place where humankind was created, so because it refers to the truth of origin, in order to live the joyous life. So in singing this song, Nepalese followers of Tenrikyō set Jiba as the joyous life as two objects of value. Jiba, the place where they long to visit to join God the parent, and to follow his will, and the joyous life, which is this ideal life that they aim to construct by following the Tenrikyō teachings, which also include the daily performance of the ritual. So I want to introduce now the second song of the Theodori, this dance movement, the movement dance. So we're going to maybe listen to watch the second an excerpt from the second song. So the second song of the Theodori section states, when the marvelous construction is begun, how lively it is. Tushigina fushin kakareba yare nigivashia. The world will change to prosperity, yonaori, and peace will reign everywhere. Tokoro no osamariga. The expression marvelous construction, fushigina fushin, which also appears in other songs, refers to the construction of the joyous life, or the ultimate future-oriented goal of each Tenrikyō follower. So, as mentioned above, the world of the joyous life is conceptualized as this ideal society. So, a world of prosperity, where people live in harmony, following the teachings of God the Parent. However, for Nepalese Tenrikyō followers, this concept also bears additional meaning, and it is shaped according to what is relevant to them as members of Nepalese society. So, for many of them, Jiba, in Japan, is conceptualized as the place where the joyous life has already been fully realized. So that when they write about their experience of pilgrimage to Jiba, they often say, we really seemed to have reached the door of the joyous life. Sache anandi jivan ko dwaramapugeko abaraskarekatyamu. And Tenri City, and more broadly Japan and Japanese society, are seen as a model that could be followed to improve the conditions of Nepalese society, especially in terms of development. So in another testimony, for example, we can read, seeing Japan, I felt like our country was kind of lacking. So us too, let's learn to be wise and active. Let's make Nepal a developed country like Japan. Japan dekhera malai hamro desh kasto lagyo. Tesere ami pani yani ragyarila banga sikau. Ra Nepal lai pani Japan jastai vikasi desh bano. So the joyous life is thus associated by Nepalese followers to the idea of a better and more developed society. And during those convivial moments that we had every morning, Nepalese members of Mitsumoya also emphasized that for them, Japan had managed to combine tradition and modernity. So that's how they see Japan. So from their point of view, Japan was the one country in Asia which had managed to maintain its traditional religious and social values while simultaneously become a modern society with infrastructures and facilities. But then Japan had reached both material infrastructure development, bautic vikas, and spiritual development, adhyatmic vikas. And Nepal could do the same if only people followed the Tenrikyō teachings, obviously working together in unison towards such a hoped-for future. The temporality set by the ritual performance is a future-oriented one in which the joyous life is set as the ultimate objective of a marvelous construction, Fushigina-Fushin. And for Nepalese followers, this goal is further conceptualized as a developed society, which has been able to reconcile tradition and modernity, and which they hope to be able to experience in Nepal in the future. So how do the words, the rhythm, and the embodied experience of space in the text, space of the text, and space as text, affect their subjectivity and their affective stance, shaping them as Tenrikyō followers? In other words, how does the semiotic landscape constructed and inhabited by practitioners turns them into committed believers? Well, as mentioned earlier, when entering the prayer room, Nepalese followers of Tenrikyō immediately orientate themselves towards Jiba, Japan, the place where humankind was created by God the Parent. The altar, as we have seen, is characterized by the very presence of these three lodges, which enshrine the main deity, and the other two empty ones, the signposts, the shrines of the founders, and the shrines of the ancestors in Tenri. When walking into the room, the practitioner kneels down and bows to these three entities, acknowledging their presence. Practitioners clap their hands 4 times, and while bowing, engage in a silent and respectful dialogue with the entity they have just greeted. They acquire a revealing attitude and a state of concentration before starting the ritual performance. We could perhaps say that the very articulation of this space orientates the bodies towards the place which they consider to be a model of their conceptualization of the joyous life, as the altar is located in that direction. Also, by singing the songs which refer to the future-oriented construction of such a model society, they seem to enter a new temporal and also affective regime, which is made of hopeful and clear determination. So, what's this hope and determination? How can we analyze these passions, these affective stances? Well, hope is a passion characterized by the aspectual qualification. So the aspect of this passion is durativity. It's experienced as a hopeful waiting, but also it has a certain incoativity because it's a hopeful looking forward, experienced by the subject with a certain model attitude. There's a modality too, of having to be or believing to be, that makes them that makes the subject experience a sense of anticipation of that outcome, which is not yet, we would say, according to Bloch and Miyazaki. Determination, on the other hand, is a passion characterized by the intensive qualification of durativity as a firmness of purpose. So in terms of aspect, it's a durativity that you have. But it's experienced by the subject then through a certain modality, a modal attitude of wanting to, which is want to construct the joyous life. So that constantly and intensively pushes the subject to act. So the space of Jiba and the ideal of the joyous life described in the songs is thus extended beyond the text of the prayers to be embodied by the performers in their gestures and movements, as they set also a disposition, so an affective stance, which looks like a resolve to wanting to work hard for the construction of the joyous life. So we could conceptualize the emergence and experience of these two passions of hope and determination as the emergence of an affective regime that is set in place by the physical and material space where the ritual is performed, by the space of Jiba evoked in the text, by the rhythm of the prayer, by the bodily orientation of the practitioners, and by the hoped-for ideal world of the joyous life, which is this other space that appears and is put forward in the text. So we defines an affective regime as, quote, the set of conditions that govern with varying degrees of hegemonic status the ways in which particular kinds of affect can be appropriately materialized in the context of a given site. Because an affective regime operates at the level of the site, even in absence of any particular individual, that is, even when a given site happens to be uninhabited or unoccupied, it is still meaningful to speak of an affective regime associated with the environment. This is because the site itself can be structured in ways that are intended to evoke particular dispositions, regardless of whether anyone happens to be present, end quote. In other words, the way in which a place is articulated, its structure and its experience within a certain cultural context and a certain understanding of its nature has an impact on the affective dispositions adopted by those who inhabit it, and it can more or less explicitly regulate those orientations. In the case of Tenrikyō prayer, on the Tenrikyō prayer center, not only the articulation of the space of the room as described above, but also the space described and indexically hinted in the text, and the soundscape, which is made of songs sung in Japanese with a rhythm that stresses some terms concerning Jiba, the place where humankind was created in Japan, and also its related deictics. In other words, the entire multimodal experience of such semiotic landscape during the service generates a resemantized space focused on the construction of the joyous life. So this whole performance changes the articulation of the space and reorients everything, the space and the performance, towards this attitude of wanting to construct the joyous life. The encapsulation of Jiba and the joyous life as objects of value in the lyrics and in the space of the performance reshapes the subjectivities and the affective stance of the practitioners that resemantize themselves as well as Tenrikyō committed followers who want to, so the stance of determination, construct the joyous life as, and they hope for its realization.